All right, let's get into this January 1 cattle inventory report from the USDA. Just a reminder for those who may not have tuned in before, normally we get this report twice a year. It was canceled due to budget battles and politics in Washington, D.C. in 2024 in July. So this is really the first time we're getting to look at these inventory numbers in a year.
Yeah, so as you kind of set the floor, this is kind of like Christmas to us as ag economists, because this is going to be the only report we get to see snapshots of the national herd inventories. And so, we get anecdotal evidence from like percentage of heifers on feed and stuff like that. But the January 1 report, it had some interesting things to talk about. So just overall, all cattle and calves totaled 86.7 million at the beginning of this year, which is 1% lower compared to last year. And last year was at 87.2 million head. And so the biggest thing that we take away from that, though, is when we were moving from 2023 into 2024, our pace of liquidation was 2%. If we compare 2024 to 2025, we still liquidated 1%, but that 1% is still slower than we saw in the previous year. And I think that's kind of telling. One, that gives us, some type of signal that we're slowing down, the herd size in terms of the shrinking and the liquidation that we're seeing. But I think it's kind of almost a stat that we got to pay attention to throughout the year, though, when it comes to cattle on feed and placements and things of that nature, because when we think about national cow slaughter, prices are really high. And we see that there's the total number of slaughter cows has been decreasing. And so to me, when I see this national report and the national herd, we know that people have done a pretty hard job of culling, or have done a hard culling job for the past, 2, maybe 3 years. And so, people are sitting there with calves and they're saying, hey, I might not be able to expand, but I'm not going to be culling as much because, one, they've already done that. But two, as long as the cow's healthy and she's doing her job and spitting out a calf on time and every year, those calves are very valuable. And so I was expecting us to decrease probably higher than what came out, but it was still a decrease nonetheless, and it was a slower pace. And so that was like one of the first things that I saw when I opened the report, just from that first page that comes out. But as we dig deeper into the report, beef cows were at 27.9 million head, which is down 1.3%, or almost 150,000 head compared to a year ago. Again, the same story, though. The pace of change from 2024 to 2025 was lower compared to the pace of change from 23 to 24. And just kind of refresh that memory, or for folks, that was at 2%. So again, we go from a 2% decrease, 23 into 24, down to a 1% decrease from 24 to 25. But the more fun stuff to look at is not just the aggregate of numbers. It's more of like, where are things changing in the country? And so not every state decreased, not every state increased their herd size. A lot of states were kind of held constant. And so on the cows that have calved, beef cows that have calved, California and Virginia were both down 6% respectively. Colorado was down 7%, so that's a huge number. Kentucky was down 4%, and Pennsylvania was down 5%. And those were kind of the bigger yearly changes that kind of stuck out to me. But then there was also some increases. Texas and Oklahoma both increased 1% respectively. And so we know that Texas is a large cattle state. So a 1% increase is a pretty important sign or a pretty important number to think about. Missouri was up 2%. And a big jump, kind of one I was not expecting, was Wisconsin, which was up 6%. So we have a mixed bag of some states increasing, some states are decreasing, and then we have a lot of states kind of holding steady. And that was something we kind of expected as economists, just because if we think about herd expansion or any possibility, drought is always going to be one of the drivers. And we know that there's been some drought in certain areas. But if you look at Oklahoma and in large parts of Texas, drought was kind of not really needing to be thought about. But then the other side of that coin is inputs. Inputs are kind of in a holding pattern, so they're still kind of high relative to the previous years. And then also when we start thinking about land availability, I think in the the biggest differences between the 2013, 2014, 2015 timeframe and when we saw the ramp up of the herd versus right now, rental space and rental acres are more expensive. Availability of acreage is down in certain parts of the country, and I'll use Tennessee as a prime example. Middle Tennessee now versus Middle Tennessee 10 years ago are two different things. A farmer might not be able to rent the acres out there next to him because it could be in development now. It could be in housing development, for instance. So that's an extreme example, but it's just kind of highlighting that point. If we
Charlie,
get it, yeah.
Sorry, when you look at these numbers, obviously we're talking drought and we're talking growth. When you look at some of the areas that stayed the same, and if I'm throwing you a curveball, I'm sorry, we can always come back to this another time. But like thinking about the Dakotas or some of those other areas, how are those also stacking up? Nebraska, like I think about kind of that Western Corn Belt where we see some of those other types of herds or some of those larger operations. Just knowing about growth and how much does that play into this when we think about only getting these numbers once a year and to have some insight into what's been happening.
Yeah, so if we look at North Dakota for beef cows that have calved, they've stayed pretty constant. There was only a minimal increase. If we look at a place like South Dakota, just south of them, they actually had a 3% drop in beef cows that have calved. And so, it kind of, if we think about it from that standpoint, they're in the same region per se, right? But within those industries, we see some fluctuations and differences. And so, it's going to be one of those things that I think that moving forward, if we think about expansion happening probably this year or possibility, I think that there's a lot of learned by doing activity or thinking that's happening. What I mean by that is last time we had the herd liquidation, when we ramped back up, we ramped up pretty fast, pretty quick. There was a lot of things that were in our favor as producers for producers on that side, lower cost of inputs, drought was not an issue. And now and then following that, there was a massive drop in prices pretty rapidly because we ramped up so fast. And so I think when we look at states across the country, when I say that a lot of people are holding pattern compared to the previous year, I think some of that could be allocated to the fact that people might not want to ramp up as fast as they did last time because they got burned pretty hard on the back end. And then also, if you look at the cost of replacement females right now or bred heifers and bred cows, they're pretty expensive. And so I think that's kind of playing into the fact of why we're seeing a lot of these states hold pattern. And yeah, we use South Dakota, North Dakota, and they're in the same region, but they have different activities happening in terms of their herd size. And so, you're in Kentucky, we're in Tennessee. We both had similar type patterns where we saw some decreases in numbers, but y'all had a lot more of in terms of percentage, y'all had a higher percentage change than us here in Tennessee. So I think to your question is valid. And I think it's kind of just one of those deals where there's a lot of factors that might limit the expansion or why we see people just kind of sitting where they are just because of what happened last time, let alone of all the factors that we've talked about.